Urartu is corresponding to the biblical Kingdom of Ararat. Kingdom of Van was an Iron Age kingdom centered on Lake Van in the Armenian Highlands. Strictly speaking, Urartu is the Assyrian term for a geographical region, while Kingdom of Urartu or Biainili lands are terms used in modern historiography for the Urartian-speaking Iron Age state that arose in that region. The language appears in cuneiform inscriptions. It is argued on linguistic evidence that proto-Armenian came in contact with Urartian at an early date before formation of Urartian kingdom. That a distinction should be made between the geographical and the political entity was already pointed out by Kunik. The landscape corresponds to the mountainous plateau between Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Urartian plateau, and the Caucasus Mountains, later known as the Armenian Highlands. The kingdom rose to power in the mid-9th century BC, but was conquered by the Medes in the early 6th century BC. The heirs of Urartu are the Armenians and the successive kingdoms. The name Urartu comes from Assyrian sources. Shalmaneser I recorded a campaign in which he subdued the entire territory of Urartu. The Shalmaneser text uses the name Urartu to refer to a geographical region, not a kingdom, and names 8 lands contained within Urartu. Urartu is cognate with the biblical Ararat, Akkadian Urashto, and Armenian Ararat. The name used by the local population as a toponym was Biainili, which forms the root of the Armenian. Hence the names Kingdom of Van or Vanic Kingdom. Scholars such as Carl Ferdinand Friedrich Lehmann Haupt believed that the people of Urartu called themselves Kaldini after the god Aldi. Boris Piotrowski wrote that the Urartians first appear in history in the 13th century BC as a league of tribes or countries which did not yet constitute a unitary state. In the Assyrian annals, the term Urartu as a name for this league was superseded during a considerable period of years by the term Land of Neri. Scholars believe that Urartu is an Akkadian variation of Ararat of the Old Testament. Indeed, Mount Ararat is located in ancient Urartian territory, approximately 120 kilometers north of its former capital. In addition to referring to the famous biblical mountain, Ararat also appears as the name of a kingdom in Jeremiah chapter 51 verse 27, mentioned together with Mini and Ashkenaz. In the early 6th century BC, Urartu was replaced by the Armenian Oroted dynasty. In the trilingual Behistun inscription carved in 521 or 520 BC by the order of Darius I, the country referred to as Urartu in Assyrian is called Armenia in Old Persian and Harmenuia in the Elamite language. Chupria was part of the Urartu Confederation. Later, there is reference to a district in the area called Armor, which some scholars have linked to the name of Armenia. Geography. Urartu comprised an area of approximately 200,000 square miles, extending from the river Urar in the north, to the northern foothills of the Taurus Mountains in the south, and from the Euphrates in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east. At its apogee, Urartu stretched from the borders of northern Mesopotamia to the southern Caucasus, including present-day Armenia and southern Georgia as far as the river Urar. Archaeological sites within its boundaries include Altintepe, Toprakala, Patnos and Hakob. Urartu fortresses included Erebani, Van Fortress, Argoshti, Biainili, Anzif, Hakob, and Baskal, as well as Biainili and others. Discovery. Inspired by the writings of the medieval Armenian historian Movses Khorenatsi, the French scholar Jean Saint-Martin suggested that his his government sent Friedrich Eduard Schultz, a German professor, to the Van area in 1827 on behalf of the French Oriental Society. Schultz discovered and copied numerous cuneiform inscriptions, partly in Assyrian and partly in a hitherto unknown language. Schultz also rediscovered the Kojoyan stela, bearing an Assyrian-Urartian bilingual inscription, located on the Kojoyan Pass on the current Iraqi-Iranian border. A summary account of his initial discoveries was published in 1828. Schultz and 4 of his servants were murdered by Kurds in 1829 near Barskale. His notes were later recovered and published in Paris in 1840. In 1828, the British Assyriologist Henry Cresig Rawlinson had attempted to copy the inscription on the Kojoyan stela, but failed because of the ice on the stela's front side. The German scholar R. Roche made a similar attempt a few years later, but he and his party were attacked and killed. In the late 1840s, Sir Austin Henry Laird examined and described the Urartian rock-cut tombs of Van Castle, including the Argosty chamber. For the 1870s, local residents began to plunder the Toprakala ruins, selling its artifacts to European collections. In the 1880s, this site underwent a poorly executed excavation organized by Hormuzd Rassam on behalf of the British Museum. Almost nothing was properly documented. The first systematic collection of Urartian inscriptions, and thus the beginning of Urartology as a specialized field, dates to the 1870s, with the campaign of Sir Archibald Henry Sayce. The German engineer Karl Sester, discoverer of Mount Nemrut, collected more inscriptions in 1890 over 1. Valdemar Belk visited the area in 1891, discovering the Rusa stela. A further expedition planned for 1893 was prevented by Turkish-Armenian hostilities. Belk, together with Lehman Haupt, visited the area again in 1898, excavating Toprakala. On this expedition, Belk reached the Kojoyan stela, but he was attacked by Kurds and barely escaped with his life. Belk and Lehman Haupt reached the stela again in a second attempt, but were again prevented from copying the inscription by weather conditions. After another assault on Belk provoked the diplomatic intervention of Wilhelm II, Sultan Abdulhamid II agreed to pay Belk a sum of 80,000 gold marks in reparation. During World War I, the Lake Van region briefly fell under Russian control. In 1916, the Russian scholars Nikolai Yakovlevich Mar and Yosef Abgarovich Orbli, excavating at the Van fortress, uncovered a 4-faced stela carrying the annals of Tsar-Uri II. In 1939, Boris Borisovich Piotrovsky excavated Khmer Bleu, discovering Tezbait, the city of the god of war, Tezbar. In 1938-40, excavations by the American scholars Kersop and Silver Lake were cut short by World War II, and most of the finds and field records were lost when a German submarine torpedoed the ship, the SS Athenia. The surviving documents were published by Manfred Kaufmann in 1977. A new phase of excavations began after the war. Excavations were at first restricted to Soviet Armenia. The fortress of Khmer Bleu, dating from the reign of Rusa II, was excavated by a team headed by Boris Piotrovsky, and for the first time the excavators of a Urartian site published the findings systematically. Beginning in 1956, Charles A. Burney identified and sketch-surveyed many Urartian sites in the Lake Van area, and, from 1959, a Turkish expedition under Tarzan Özgürk excavated Altıntepe and Arafezen. In the late 1960s, Urartian sites in northwest Iran were excavated. In 1976, an Italian team, led by Mario Salvini, finally reached the Kojoyan stela, accompanied by a heavy military escort. The Gulf War then closed these sites to archaeological research. Oktaybeli resumed excavation of Urartian sites on Turkish territory. In 1989, Ionis, a 7th century BC fortress built by Arose II of Urartu, was discovered 35 kilometers north of Van. In spite of excavations, only a third to a half of the 300 known Urartian sites in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Armenia have been examined by archaeologists. Without protection, many sites have been plundered by local residents searching for treasure and other saleable antiquities. History. Origins. Assyrian inscriptions of Shalmaneser. I first mention Urartu as one of the states of Neri, a loose confederation of small kingdoms and tribal states in the Armenian Highland in the 13th to 11th centuries BC, which he conquered. Urartu itself was in the region around Lake Van. The Neri states were repeatedly subjected to further attacks and invasions by the Assyrians, especially under Tukulti-Ninurta-I, Tiglath-Pileser-I, Ashur-bel-Kala, Adad-nirari II, Tukulti-Ninurta II, and Ashur-nazirpal II. Urartu re-emerged in Assyrian inscriptions in the 9th century BC as a powerful northern rival of Assyria. The Neri states and tribes became a unified kingdom under King Aramu, whose capital at Arzashkun was captured by the Assyrians under Shalmaneser III. Roughly contemporaries of the Urartu, living just to the west along the southern shore of the Black Sea, were the Kaskas, known from Hittite sources. Growth. A temporary eclipse of Assyria in the first half of the 8th century BC had helped Urartu's growth, as it became the largest and most powerful state in the Near East, which was accomplished in little time. Sa'd-uri, son of King Aramu, successfully resisted the Assyrian attacks from the south led by Shalmaneser III, consolidated the military power of the state and moved the capital to Tushpa. His son, Ispani, annexed the neighboring state of Musizir and made his son Sa'd-uri II viceroy. Musizir later became an important religious center of the Urartian kingdom. Ispani was in turn attacked by Shamshi-Adad V. His successor Menur also enlarged the kingdom greatly and left inscriptions over a wide area. Urartu reached the highest point of its military might under Menur's son Argishti-I, becoming one of the most powerful kingdoms of ancient Near East. Argishti-I added more territories along the Araxes River and Lake Sevan, and frustrated Shalmaneser IV's campaigns against him. Argishti also founded several new cities, most notably Erebani in 782 BC. 6,600 captured slaves worked on the construction of the new city. At its height, the Urartu kingdom may have stretched north beyond the Aras River and Lake Sevan, encompassing present-day Armenia and even the southern part of Georgia, almost to the shores of the Black Sea, west to the sources of the Euphrates, east to present-day Tabriz, Lake Urmia and beyond, and south to the sources of the Tigris. Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria conquered Urartu in the first year of his reign. The Assyrians found horsemen and horses tamed as colts for riding that were unequaled in the south, where they were harnessed to Assyrian war chariots. Decline and recuperation. In 714 BC, the Urartu kingdom suffered heavily from Sumerian raids and the campaigns of Sargon II. The main temple at Mushashir was sacked, and the Urartian king Rusa I was crushingly defeated by Sargon II at Lake Urmia. He subsequently committed suicide in shame. As son Argishti II restored Urartu's position against the Sumerians. However, it was no longer a threat to Assyria, and peace was made with the new king of Assyria, Sennacherib, in 705 BC. This in turn helped Urartu enter a long period of development and prosperity, which continued through the reign of Argashti's son Rusa II. After Rusa II, however, the Urartu grew weaker under constant attacks from Sumerian and Scythian invaders. As a result, it became dependent on Assyria, as evidenced by Rusa II's son Sard-uri III, referring to the Assyrian king Ashur-bani as his father. According to Urartian epigraphy, Sard-uri III was followed by three kings: Erimena, his son Rusa III, and the latter's son Rusa IV. Late during the 7th century BC, Urartu was invaded by Scythians and their allies, the Medes. In 612 BC, the Median king Cyaxares the Great, together with Nabopolassar of Babylon and the Scythians, conquered Assyria after it had been badly weakened by civil war. The Medes then took over the Urartian capital of Van towards 585 BC, effectively ending the sovereignty of Urartu. According to the Armenian tradition, the Medes helped the Armenians establish the Urartid dynasty. Many Urartian ruins of the period show evidence of destruction by fire. This would indicate two scenarios: either Media subsequently conquered Urartu, bringing about its subsequent demise, or Urartu maintained its independence and power, going through a mere dynastic change. As a local Armenian dynasty overthrew the ruling family with the help of the Median army. Ancient sources support the latter version. Xenophon, for example, states that Armenia, ruled by an Urartid king, was not conquered until the reign of Median king Astyages, long after Median invasion of the late 7th century BC. Similarly, Strabo read that, in ancient times, Greater Armenia ruled the whole of Asia after it broke up the empire of the Syrians, but later, in the time of Astyages, it was deprived of that great authority. Medieval Armenian chronicles corroborate the Greek and Hebrew sources. In particular, Moses Korenatsi writes that Armenian Prince Paru-Iskaordi helped the Median king Cyaxares and his allies conquer Assyria, for which Cyaxares recognized him as the king of Armenia, while Media conquered Armenia only much later, under Astyages. It is possible that the last Urartian king, Rusa IV, had connections to the future incoming Armenian Urartids dynasty. Urartu was destroyed in either 590 BC or 585 BC. By the late 6th century, Urartu had certainly been replaced by Armenia. Legacy. Little is known of what happened to the region of Urartu under the foreign rule following its fall. The most widely accepted theory is that settlers related to Phrygians, or more specifically tribes speaking a proto-Armenian language conventionally named Armeno-Phrygian, who had already settled in the western parts of the region prior to the establishment of Urartu, had become the ruling elite under the Median Empire, followed by the Achaemenid Empire. These Armeno-Phrygians would have mingled with the disparate peoples of Urartu, resulting a fusion of languages and cultures. They multiplied in numbers and spread the language throughout the territory of Urartu. The Urartians, during its dominance, had amalgamated disparate tribes, each of which had its own culture and traditions. Thus, when the political structure was destroyed, little remained that could be identified as one unified Urartian culture. The region formerly known as Urartu became the satrapy of Armenia under the Achaemenids, which later became an independent kingdom, the Kingdom of Armenia. The Urartians who were in the satrapy were then assimilated, becoming part of the Armenian ethnogenesis. However, other Urartians might have kept the former identity. According to Herodotus, the Alarodians, believed to be Urartian remnants, were part of the 18th satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire and formed a special contingent in the Grand Army of Xerxes I. Some Urartian traditions, such as architecture and dam constructions, were absorbed in the following Persianate societies, and most probably persisted in the satrapy of Armenia. Urartu did not give birth to a direct successor. However, the satrapy of Armenia, as an entity which emerged immediately after its fall, inherited its cultural, traditional, geographical and some linguistic aspects. Darius I, in his famous Behistun inscription, calls the region Armenia in Old Persian and Urartu in Babylonian, clearly equating the two, suggesting that both are somewhat part of a same continuous entity. As the Armenian identity developed in the region, the memory of Urartu faded and finally disappeared. The language spoken in Urartu is now extinct. Little is known of what was spoken in the geopolitical region from the time of Urartu's fall in the 6th century BC to the creation of the Armenian alphabet in the 4th century AD. In ancient Persian inscriptions, references to Armenia indicate that Urartian was still spoken, or was in a transitional period into being replaced with the Armenian language. In fact, the ethnonym Armenia itself and all other names attested with reference to the rebellions against Darius in Armenia are not connected with Armenian linguistic and onomastic material attested later in native Armenian sources. They are also not Iranian, but seem related to Urartian. The name of the province of Ararat in the Kingdom of Armenia is believed to be a continuum of the Urartu toponym. The modern name of Mount Ararat is derived from the biblical mountains of Ararat, and the Ararat province of modern Armenia is in turn named after the mountain. Economy and politics. The economic structure of Urartu was similar to other states of the ancient world, especially to Assyria. The state was heavily dependent on agriculture, which required a centralized effort to irrigation. These works, managed by kings, in their implementation participated the free inhabitants, and perhaps the prisoners as slaves. Royal governors, influenced people and, perhaps, free peoples have their own allotments. Individual territories within the state had to pay taxes, the central government grain, horses, bulls, etc. In peacetime, Urartu probably led an active trade with Assyria, providing cattle, horses, iron and wine. According to archaeological data, farming on the territory of Urartu began to develop since the Neolithic period, even in the 3rd millennium BC. In the Urartian Age, agriculture was well developed and closely related to the Assyrian on the selection of cultures and methods of processing. From cuneiform sources, it is known that in Urartu grew wheat, barley, sesame, millet and emmer, and cultivated gardens and vineyards. Many regions of the Urartu state required artificial irrigation, which has successfully been organized by the rulers of Urartu in the heyday of the state. In several regions remain ancient irrigation canals, constructed by Urartu mainly during the Argesh-Armenia period, some of which are still used for irrigation. Art and architecture. There is a number of remains of sturdy stone architecture, as well as some mud brick, especially when it has been burnt, which helps survival. Stone remains are mainly fortresses and walls, with temples and mausolei, and many rock-cut tombs. The style, which developed regional variations, shows a distinct character, partly because of the greater use of stone compared to neighboring cultures. The typical temple was square, with stone's walls as thick as the open internal area but using mud brick for the higher part. These were placed at the highest point of a citadel and from surviving depictions were high, perhaps with gabled roofs. Their emphasis on verticality has been claimed as an influence of later Christian Armenian architecture. The art of Urartu is especially notable for fine lost wax bronze objects, weapons, figurines, vessels including grand cauldrons that were used for sacrifices, fittings for furniture, and helmets. There are also remains of ivory and bone carvings, frescoes, cylinder seals, and of course pottery. In general, the style is a somewhat less sophisticated blend of influences from neighboring cultures. Archaeology has produced relatively few examples of the jewelry in precious metals that the Assyrians boasted of carrying off in great quantities. From Musizia in 714 BC. Religion. With the expansion of Urartian territory, many of the gods worshipped by conquered peoples were incorporated into the Urartian pantheon, as a means of confirming the annexation of territories and promoting political stability. However, although the Urartians incorporated many deities into the pantheon, they appeared to be selective in the choices. Although many Urartian kings made conquests in the north, such as the Lake Seven region, many of those peoples' gods remain excluded. This was most likely the case because Urartians considered the people in the north to be barbaric, and disliked the deities as much as they did them. Good examples of incorporated deities, however, are the goddesses Bhagavati and Seladi, on Mher or Mehater overlooking modern Van, Turkey. An inscription lists a total of 79 deities, and what type of sacrificial offerings should be made to each. Goats, sheep, cattle, and other animals served as the sacrificial offerings. Urartians did not practice human sacrifice. The pantheon was headed by a triad made up of Aldi, Theospar, and Shivini. The king was also the chief priest or envoy of Kaldi. Some temples to Kaldi were part of the royal palace complex, while others were independent structures. Some main gods and goddesses include Aldi, Theospar, Shivini, Arubani, Tushpara, Bhagavati, Seladi. Language. Urartian, the language used in the cuneiform inscriptions of Urartu, was an ergative agglutinative language, which belongs to neither the Semitic nor the Indo-European families but to the Hurro-Urartian family. It survives in many inscriptions found in the area of the Urartu kingdom, written in the Assyrian cuneiform script. There are also claims of autochthonous Urartian hieroglyphs, but this remains uncertain. According to many researchers about Urartu language, its link to Northeast Caucasian languages is rather certain. The Urartians originally would have used these locally developed hieroglyphs but later adapted the Assyrian cuneiform script for most purposes. After the 8th century BC, the hieroglyphic script was restricted to religious and accounting purposes. Examples of Urartian written language have survived in many inscriptions found throughout the area of the Urartu kingdom. Urartian cuneiform inscriptions are divided into two groups. A minority is written in Akkadian. However, the bulk of the cuneiforms are written in an agglutinative language, conventionally called Urartian, Chaldean, or Neo-Hurran, which was related to Hurran in the Hurro-Urartian family, and was neither Semitic nor Indo-European. Unlike the cuneiform inscriptions, Urartian hieroglyphic texts have not been successfully deciphered. As a result, scholars disagree as to what language is used in the texts, or whether they even constitute writing at all.